Prince Edward's refusal did not begin with shouting. It began with a quiet plea, a locked archive door, and Lady Louise standing in a corridor where family history suddenly felt heavier than blood. Meghan's request had reached him with urgency, but Edward made one decision that changed the entire atmosphere inside the palace. He personally escorted Louise into the royal archive and refused Meghan access. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward moved first, and that stunned everyone. He did not send a secretary. He did not ask Charles to settle it. He stepped into the corridor, calm but unyielding, while Meghan stood near the archive entrance expecting resistance, not refusal. Louise stayed beside her father, quietly pale. The Royal Archive, the protected collection where private letters, family records, estate notes, and sealed instructions are preserved, had become dangerous because it held proof of what the Queen wanted kept safe. Meghan pressed her plea with controlled force, saying she only wanted clarity. Edward heard the words, but he watched Louise instead. The young woman was not triumphant. She looked burdened, as if entering that room had placed a crown of silence on her shoulders. Edward placed one hand near her shoulder, not possessive, not theatrical, protective. That gesture said what he would not say aloud. This was not a routine archive request, and Louise would not be left alone to face whatever Meghan hoped to uncover. The corridor tightened around them. Aides stopped whispering. One palace assistant glanced toward the locked door, then back at Edward. No one intervened. Meghan's face hardened when she realized no aide would negotiate for her, and Edward would not hide behind procedure. He said, with a cold steadiness that made the assistant freeze, "This room is not for anyone trying to rewrite what was already decided." The words landed like a verdict. Louise heard the sentence and lowered her eyes, but Edward kept his gaze forward. Meghan understood that he believed her request was pointed, not innocent. She was not being denied because of mood, timing, or palace pride. She was being stopped because Edward believed the archive contained something she wanted to challenge. When the door opened for Louise and not for Meghan, the meaning became impossible to miss. Edward escorted his daughter inside, the lock turned behind them, and Meghan stood outside knowing this was no longer a plea refused. It was a declaration of sides. But before anyone could understand why Edward acted so decisively, the palace had to confront the people at the center of the storm. Behind the locked archive door stood more than boxes and records. It held the emotional collision of four people who wanted different things from the same past. Edward wanted protection. Louise wanted truth. Meghan wanted recognition. And Charles wanted silence before the dispute could spill into the open. In that single corridor, the monarchy stopped feeling like an institution and started feeling like a family breaking in real time. Edward had never been the loudest figure in the royal family, and that was exactly why his refusal carried such force. He was not known for grand public gestures or sharp personal attacks. He was known for patience, restraint, and duty. But when he felt the late Queen's private boundaries were being pushed, something in him hardened. The Royal Archive, the protected store of private royal papers, personal letters, family records, and sealed instructions, was not just a room to him, it was a line. And once Meghan's plea reached that line, Edward chose to stand in front of it. Louise understood the weight of that choice before anyone explained it. She had grown up close to her grandparents' world, not by demanding attention, but by quietly absorbing its values. She knew that Queen Elizabeth's legacy was not only held in crowns, ceremonies, and public words. It lived in private trust. It lived in the names people protected when no cameras were watching. That was why her presence near the archive mattered so deeply. She was not being used as a symbol. She was being shielded from becoming a target. Meghan saw the matter differently. Her plea carried urgency because she believed the records could shape how her own family would be remembered inside the royal story. To her, access meant recognition. It meant answers. It meant a chance to challenge a version of history that might already have been sealed without her voice. But Edward heard something else beneath the request. He heard pressure, he heard danger, and he feared that if the archive opened for Meghan, Louise's name would become part of a fight she had never chosen. Charles felt the pressure closing around him. The king wanted calm, but calm was slipping away. He understood Meghan's frustration, yet he also understood Edward's warning. Some doors, once opened, could not be quietly closed again. A private secretary noticed the moment Charles changed. Someone mentioned Louise's file, and the monarch went silent. He did not ask what file. He did not demand an explanation. His stillness suggested he already knew enough. Edward watched that silence and understood the truth of it. This was not sudden. This was not a misunderstanding born in one corridor. It had roots. It had memory. It had a moment everyone had tried to bury beneath politeness and palace discipline. And the buried incident that started it all would explain why Edward would rather face Meghan's anger than allow that archive door to open for her. The palace did not reach this crisis overnight. The trigger came months earlier, at a private Balmoral dinner, when a single conversation hardened Edward's suspicion and left Louise quietly wounded. It was not a public scandal. It was worse. It was intimate. A question asked too sharply, a name mentioned too casually, and a silence from the table that told Edward the matter would one day return. Edward had arrived at Balmoral hoping the evening would calm old tensions, not sharpen them. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate, was meant to offer distance from public pressure and space for controlled family conversations. Charles wanted the dinner to feel peaceful, and Meghan appeared composed enough to suggest that the night might pass without a rupture. Louise sat quietly near her father, carrying the kind of stillness that often made people underestimate her. But Edward knew his daughter well. He could tell when she was listening, and he could tell when she was bracing. Meghan changed the mood with one question. She asked why Louise's name had appeared in discussions connected to Queen Elizabeth's archive notes, and the room seemed to lose its air. The Queen's archive notes, private written references preserved among family papers, mattered because they could reveal not only what the monarch remembered, but who she trusted. That was why the question cut so sharply. Meghan was not asking about a ceremony or a public title. She was touching something personal, something sealed by affection and authority. Louise lowered her eyes. She did not look ashamed, because there was nothing to confess. She looked exposed. Edward saw it instantly, and the father in him responded before the royal in him could hide it. He watched Meghan hold the question in the room, watched Charles avoid answering too quickly, and watched Louise shrink beneath attention she had never invited. In that moment, Edward made a private promise. His daughter would not be cornered again over papers she had not written and decisions she had not demanded. Charles tried to smooth the silence, but the damage had already settled. A senior courtier quietly removed one folder from the table after the dinner, and Edward noticed. That small act said more than any official explanation could. The conversation had touched a protected nerve. Later, Edward learned that Meghan's team had made a follow-up request for archive clarification, a formal attempt to understand the very references raised at Balmoral. The corridor confrontation had not appeared from nowhere. It had been walking toward them for months. By the time Meghan's plea reached the Royal Archive, Edward was no longer undecided. He remembered Louise's lowered gaze. He remembered the vanished folder. He remembered Charles going still. So when Meghan finally came face to face with him, Edward was not reacting to a request. He was answering a memory. When Meghan reached the archive corridor, the palace air changed. Aides stepped back. Voices lowered. Edward did not hide behind protocol, and Meghan did not soften her demand. For once, there was no polished language to protect anyone. There was only a father, a duchess, a young woman standing nearby, and a door that had become the most powerful symbol in the building. Edward stood between Meghan and the Royal Archive with the calm of a man who had already made peace with the cost. The Royal Archive, the guarded collection of private letters, estate records, family notes, and sealed royal instructions, mattered because it carried the monarchy's most sensitive memory. It was not just history, it was evidence. It was trust, placed on paper. And Edward understood that once Meghan crossed that threshold, the fight would no longer stay outside the room. Meghan did not retreat. She insisted she had a right to understand what had been written and preserved about her family's place in the royal story. Her voice stayed controlled, but urgency pushed through every word. She believed the archive could contain the missing piece, the record that might explain why some names were protected while others were kept at the edge. For Meghan, access meant fairness. For Edward, it meant danger. And Louise, standing a few steps behind him, felt the argument turn around her name like a tightening rope. Edward answered with restrained force. He did not shout. He did not insult. That made it worse. He told Meghan that Louise would not be used as a bargaining point in a battle she never started. The words struck the corridor with a force no raised voice could match. Meghan's expression changed when Edward mentioned the Balmoral dinner. There it was. The buried memory. The old question. The moment Louise had lowered her eyes while the family pretended the damage could be managed. Louise stayed still, but Edward sensed the fear she was trying to hide. He had seen that look once before, and he refused to let it return unanswered. Meghan realized then that this confrontation was not about a single request. Edward had been carrying the Balmoral wound with him, waiting for the day it came back to the archive door. Charles was not in the corridor to soften it. No senior figure stepped forward to dilute the meaning. The decision belonged to Edward, and he wore it like a burden he would not put down. A palace aide heard him say the archive instruction came from above family pressure, and that phrase changed everything. It suggested Edward was not acting on temper, loyalty, or private resentment. A formal authority stood behind him. Meghan left the corridor shaken, not defeated by volume, but by certainty. Because Edward's refusal may have sounded personal, but the authority behind it reached far deeper than anyone in that corridor first realized. The most shocking part of Edward's refusal was not the word no, it was the calm certainty behind it. He did not ask permission. He did not glance toward Charles for rescue. He acted like a man carrying an instruction already sealed in his conscience. And when the private archive register was opened, the palace discovered that Edward's decision was not rebellion, it was obedience. Charles received the confirmation in silence, and that silence carried more weight than anger ever could. The private archive register, a controlled record showing who may enter restricted royal files and under what conditions, revealed that Edward had not invented his authority in the corridor. His stand was tied to a preserved access note connected to Queen Elizabeth's private papers. Those papers mattered because they were not public history. They were personal memory, final judgment, and family trust captured in writing. And once the note was read, the king understood why Edward had refused to move aside. Edward had followed an instruction that placed Louise at the center of a protected classification. The note required her to be personally accompanied if her name appeared in a sealed family reference, meaning her presence inside the archive had not been casual, symbolic, or emotional theater. It was deliberate. It had been planned before Meghan's plea, before the corridor confrontation, before anyone tried to turn the locked door into a battle of personalities. Louise was not walking into the archive because Edward favored his daughter. She was walking in because the late Queen's own boundaries had made room for her. Charles set the page down slowly. He was not only reading a rule, he was facing the truth that Edward had protected the monarch's line when the king himself had hesitated. That realization cut deeply. Charles wanted peace. He wanted the dispute contained. Yet the preserved note showed that peace without protection would have been weakness. Edward had not embarrassed him. Edward had done what Charles could not do quickly enough. He had defended a boundary before it collapsed. Edward remained outwardly calm when the finding reached him, but calm did not mean comfort. Defending Louise had placed him directly against Meghan, and he understood the cost of that. He knew the refusal would be judged, repeated, twisted, and carried through the palace like a warning. Still, he did not soften it. Some duties did not feel victorious. Some duties felt like standing alone, while everyone else decided whether your loyalty was courage or betrayal. Meghan's request was then marked as denied, because it conflicted with a prior royal restriction, not because Edward disliked the plea or feared the question. That distinction changed the entire mood. The corridor dispute became something larger, something official, something impossible to dismiss. Once the instruction was confirmed, the fallout moved from the corridor into the wider palace, where loyalty became impossible to hide. And when the palace understood that Edward had acted with authority, the first emotional collapse came from the person who expected the door to open. Meghan had expected resistance. She had not expected finality. The denial left no soft edge, no compromise, no private viewing, no quiet arrangement through aides. It told her that the archive was not merely closed for the day, it was closed to her purpose. And as word moved through palace offices, Edward's single refusal became a dividing line no one could pretend not to see. Meghan sat with the weight of that rejection, pressing harder than the refusal itself. The request had been formally rejected and logged, which meant Edward's answer was no longer only a spoken decision in a tense corridor. It had become part of the palace record, a formal archive log, the written entry that records access requests, approvals, and denials, mattered because it turned private tension into documented fact. Meghan could replay Edward's words, but she could not undo the mark now placed beside her name. Palace staff understood the meaning immediately. This was not a simple matter of timing, courtesy, or restricted paperwork. It was a direct clash over legacy, entitlement, and Queen Elizabeth's private boundaries. The late monarch's boundaries mattered because they shaped who could touch the most sensitive parts of royal memory and who had to remain outside them. Edward's refusal had not weakened Louise. It had strengthened her. The very plea Meghan believed might open the archive had instead confirmed that Louise stood inside a protected circle. Meghan felt that truth settle painfully. She had asked for recognition, but the denial made her appear to be pressing against something already settled. She had wanted clarity about how her family was placed within the royal story, yet the palace response suggested the answer existed and would not be reshaped by pressure. That was the emotional blow. Not just exclusion, finality. Not just a locked door, a locked meaning. Edward turned from the wider fallout and went to Louise. He did not arrive with speeches or promises. He asked if she was all right, and the question broke the silence between them. Louise admitted she had felt frightened, not because Meghan had raised her voice, but because affection inside the family had shifted so quickly into suspicion. Edward heard the sadness in her answer. He knew then that protection had come too late to spare her from pain, but not too late to keep the damage from defining her. An archivist then mentioned something that changed the mood again. Meghan's requested file category was linked to inheritance references and private family placement, the kind of record that could turn personal memory into public conflict if mishandled. Worse still, there was a second sealed note connected to the matter, one Edward had not yet shown Louise. The fallout was severe, but the real turning point had only just arrived, because once the door closed behind father and daughter, the argument outside became less important than the truth waiting inside. Inside the royal archive, the noise of the palace disappeared. There were no aides, no duchess waiting outside, no king trying to contain the damage. There was only Edward, Louise, and the quiet burden of papers preserved by a queen who knew her family too well. For the first time, Louise was not being protected from the truth. She was being trusted with it. Edward let the silence settle before he spoke, because he knew this moment could not be rushed. The royal archive had always carried a strange power in the family, not because it held jewels or titles, but because it preserved private words that outlived public smiles. The archive mattered because it could show what people meant when ceremony ended and duty became personal. Louise understood that now. She was not standing inside a room of old papers. She was standing inside the hidden memory of a family that had spent generations turning pain into protocol. Edward told Louise that Queen Elizabeth's private notes were never meant to become weapons. The Queen, he explained, had written certain things for protection, not for revenge. That distinction mattered because Meghan's requested file category would have exposed private remarks never intended for public argument. Edward did not say it with anger. He said it with sorrow. He wanted Louise to understand that the refusal outside had not been about humiliating Meghan. It had been about stopping a family wound from becoming a public trial. Louise listened, and the strength she had shown in the corridor began to tremble. Edward told her she had not been chosen because of rank, noise, or ambition. She had been trusted because the late monarch saw steadiness in her. That word reached something deep. Louise had spent years standing quietly at the edge of royal attention, never forcing herself into the center, never turning affection into demand. Now she understood that her quietness had not made her invisible. It had made her dependable. Edward's voice changed when he admitted the hardest truth. His refusal of Meghan had not been punishment. It had been protection. He feared Louise would be dragged into someone else's claim, used as proof, used as contrast, used as a name in a battle she never asked to fight. For a father, that fear was sharper than any palace dispute. For a royal, it was a test of loyalty. Edward had chosen both duty and blood, and the choice had wounded him too. Then Louise read the sealed reference. The phrase was simple, quietly dependable. It did not sound grand, but it struck harder than praise. It changed her place in the story. Edward showed her why Meghan's request could not be granted, and Louise finally understood the door outside had closed to protect something fragile inside. When they left the archive, she was no longer only shielded by her father. She was strengthened by the Queen's trust. And once the palace doors could no longer contain the meaning of Edward's stand, the public seized on one image that defined the entire crisis. By morning, the private corridor had become a national image. The story was no longer only about Meghan's denied plea or Edward's locked door. It became about who had the right to carry the Queen's memory forward. One newspaper front page captured it with brutal simplicity. Edward walking beside Lady Louise, her face pale but steady, while the archive door stood closed behind them. Charles saw the coverage before anyone could soften it for him. He read the headline in silence, and the stillness around him said everything. The monarchy had survived storms before, but this was different, because the wound was not coming from outside pressure. It came from inside the family, from a locked room, from names preserved in papers no one was supposed to fight over. The newspaper front page mattered, because it turned a private royal dispute into a public symbol. Edward was no longer just a brother protecting his daughter. Louise was no longer just a young royal caught in a family dispute. Together, they had become the image of guarded legacy. Meghan saw the same image and understood its force immediately. The public framing had moved against her before she could explain the plea in her own words. Her request now looked like pressure. Edward's refusal looked like protection. That contrast hurt, because it reduced a complicated hunger for recognition into one sharp national impression. Meghan had wanted access to meaning, but the front page made it appear that she had pushed against the Queen's final boundaries. And once that idea entered public conversation, it became almost impossible to pull back. The palace tried to keep its response controlled. A short statement emphasized respect for private family papers and the importance of preserving sensitive records. That language mattered because royal statements are not only words, they are signals. They tell the public what the institution will defend and what it will not explain. By refusing to criticize Edward, the palace quietly confirmed that his stand had not been rejected from within. By refusing to challenge Louise's presence, it allowed her dignity to grow in public view. Then the story sharpened further. A broadcaster described the moment as the day the archive door became a royal judgment, and the phrase spread because it sounded like what many people already felt. A small crowd gathered near Windsor's public gates, holding flowers for the late Queen, and speaking Louise's name with unexpected sympathy. They were not cheering scandal. They were responding to restraint. They saw a young woman protected by a father, and a grandmother's memory defended against pressure. Edward understood the danger of that sympathy. Public support could comfort, but it could also trap Louise inside a role she had never asked to play. Charles understood it too, and that troubled him deeply. Meghan understood something harsher. The image could not be reversed. The palace could explain, soften, and contain, but it could not erase what people believed they had seen. Edward's act had become a verdict before the final words were spoken. And when the noise finally settled, the monarchy was left with one undeniable verdict about Edward, Meghan, Louise, and the Queen's legacy. In the end, the story was not about a locked room. It was about the line between asking for a place in history and forcing open a history that had already spoken. Edward's refusal gave the monarchy something rare, a moment of moral clarity. Meghan's plea exposed the hunger around royal legacy, but Louise's quiet walk into the archive revealed who had been trusted to carry it. Edward stood beside Louise after the storm, and no longer looked like a man defending himself. He looked like a father who had paid the price of doing what others feared to do. The Royal Archive, the protected collection of private letters, family records, estate notes, and sealed instructions, mattered because it held not only the monarchy's history, but the late Queen's personal boundaries. Those boundaries mattered because they separated memory from ambition and trust from pressure. Edward had protected that line, and even those who disliked the pain of his choice could not deny its purpose. Louise carried the result differently. She did not turn the moment into victory. She did not demand attention from it. That was why the Queen's trust around her felt so powerful. The sealed notes, private written instructions preserved from the late monarch, remained protected, but their meaning had become clear without being exposed. Some legacies are not seized, they are entrusted. Louise emerged as the emotional heir of restraint, not power, and that made her presence stronger than any public claim. Meghan faced the cruelest truth of all. Access could not create belonging when the record itself reflected choices already made. Her plea had come from a desire to be recognized inside the royal story, but the closed door answered with a silence she could not negotiate. It did not erase her. It did not destroy her. It simply showed that this part of the family's private inheritance had never been hers to open. Meghan understood that recognition forced through pressure could never feel the same as trust given freely. Charles accepted the outcome in the only way that mattered. He did not overturn Edward's decision. He did not reopen the question. The king allowed the refusal to stand, and that silence became a confirmation of legitimate authority. Edward became the guardian. Louise became the trusted bearer. Meghan remained outside this private inheritance, and the monarchy chose memory over pressure. Edward's hand on that archive door became the final answer. The Queen's legacy would not be negotiated in anger, reopened by pressure, or carried by the loudest voice. It would remain with those she trusted most. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.